in its right context, beauty will save the world. The famous quote from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. We have measures by which to create the beautiful in our communities, in our artworks, in our conversation, which are staggering in a culture that becomes increasingly ugly. I don't see why we would ever despair. I think this sounds a bit corny. This is our moment to shine. We really can.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We try to see all things through the lens of Jesus. We're in a series called The Way Back. Is there a way back to Christian faith in our post-Christian West? And somebody who definitely thinks the answer is yes is Andrew Fellows. He's a writer and speaker. His latest book is called Smuggling Jesus Back into the Church, and he joins me on the line now. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, as I thought about this topic of the way back to faith in our post-Christian moment, yours was one of the names I thought of most prominently. You've been speaking into this area for decades now. Can you give us some sense of where you think we are in the culture? If you could sort of put a pin in you are here in the kind of the ideological map of what people think today in the modern West, how would you describe it?
I think I would use the words of the psalmist in Psalm 11, verse 3. The foundations are being destroyed. And that leaves us with the question, so what do the righteous do? I quite like the word being. I don't think they're entirely destroyed, but they are quickly being destroyed. And I think that offers a huge challenge and an opportunity.
Tell me about some of these foundations. What do you see as being destroyed in this current moment?
I think we are seeing the obliteration of a Judeo-Christian foundation. I actually see, I know you've done so much work in this, Glenn, yourself. I see the foundations, I call them the 7 pillars of Europe, which would be things like rationality, human dignity, the kind of things you wrote about in your book, The Air We Breathe. Those things are still there, but they're pillars that are no longer substantiated and grounded in the foundation of the biblical worldview. And without foundations, pillars will crumble and fall. And a lot of my talk with non-Christians is about substantiation of the values that are still around. But because the foundation's being destroyed, that substantiation is becoming increasingly difficult.
Yes, I resonate with so much of that. I was thinking the other day about the parable of the Good Samaritan as something that has been foundational in the way we orient ourselves morally in the world. And we all know now that the thing to do is not to walk on by, but to be incredibly gracious to this outsider who is marginalized, who is poor, who is weak, who definitely needs help. And we all know that the good thing to do is to be the Good Samaritan. I was reflecting, though, that what we cannot imagine is the priest and the Levites' response. You know, the first two people, following the Old Testament law, decided that, well, who knows who this guy is, and I at least know the pillars of what Leviticus demands of me. I will follow those pillars of what Leviticus demands of me, and I will walk on by. And one of the signs we're in a very Christianized but post-Christian West is that we cannot even imagine ourselves into the sandals of a priest or a Levite, or even a priest adjacent or priest affirming, Jew who sees the value of the law. Instead, what we see is the absolute, virtue of compassion, but it's compassion divorced from law. And I've been wondering out loud, I wonder what you think about this, whether sort of nature and grace have swapped places in modern life. And it used to be that we could rely on things like what C.S. Lewis would call the Tao, in terms of a moral order. There's a moral grain to the universe. You go against the moral grain, you get splinters. There is an up, there is a down, there is a due north, kind of morally speaking. That was sort of the nature that is sort of assumed by all traditional cultures. But we now live in a society where that kind of nature is denied at all sorts of levels. But what we now take as unquestioned dogma is the kind of grace of being a good Samaritan, of showing compassion. And I was thinking the other day of the things that we take to be absolutely dogmatically true are things that are empirically, like, unverifiable. Things like, that there is a secular sphere, things like that there are human rights, things like that that we are all equal, things like that we ought to show compassion like the Good Samaritan shows compassion. In none of these things can be derived from nature. They've actually come to us through the Jesus Revolution and been detached and distorted in that journey. But we are taking for granted grace and we are denying nature. What do you think about my thesis?
I think I'm with you completely. Nature and grace, the way they've been used philosophically, are quite complex, and I always want to ask them what they mean by those terms. But I think I pick up how you're using them, and that's how I would use them too. In a sense, supernatural realities that can't be substantiated in the biological versus the natural order. I think we're disordered on both fronts. So I'm fascinated today how, in a sense, we're naturalists, most of us in the West now, and have a naturalistic explanation for origins. But as materialists, as naturalists, we're completely committed to overcoming nature. I think this is kind of the latest iteration of what I'm calling techno-humanism, that we don't like the givens of nature, the limitations it puts upon us. So we want to overcome it. Transhumanism would be a great example of that. But on the other side of the disorder, things like compassion and human rights is all the rhetoric we use today. But what do people actually mean by these realities? And if I push a little bit, I don't sense enough of substance to actually hold these things.
Yes. Yeah, so the hashtag be kind is used on some of the most poisonous tweets that you can read in the Twitter sphere. And tolerance is used often as a cudgel to beat down those who you think are being intolerant. And so, yes, absolutely, the rhetoric and the garb that is being used to forward your ends are always in terms of diversity, inclusion, equity, compassion, rights, and that kind of speak. Whether it actually reflects anything of the gracious way of Jesus, probably not. You mentioned about our dislike for determination to elide all constraints. I was speaking with Mary Harrington. In fact, Mary Harrington was the first interviewee on the way back a couple of months ago, and she is noticing absolutely that coming as a feminist. She is noticing how actually there's a branch of feminism that wants to get rid of all limits, which actually ends up erasing women and female experience, and therefore is undermining its own kind of feminism. And she would argue that we are already transhumanist and have been since the 1960s, in that we've switched off this capacity in women through contraception, such that now the default is that we have disabled a feature of humanity in order to transcend our limits and live free of that. And that has all sorts of consequences, which she lays out in her book, Feminism Against Progress. Would you see the 1960s in that kind of way as a major step towards transhumanism? Or
in terms of the transgender movement, I would see Judith Butler as, post 60s, very much creating it. When she unhitched femininity from biology completely, that's just an open door to more of a transgender ideology, which is interesting because today the transgender movement and certain branches of feminism are completely at odds with each other, but feminism created. Have you seen the Genesis of Gender, a Christian theory by Abigail Pavala? Yeah, she makes this point very, very well. She's done stuff with Mary Harrington. It's I think it's a game-changing book.
Okay, I need to. People have recommended that to me. Yeah, what does she say there?
Well, it's basically that thesis that Simone de Beauvoir began to open the door by deeply questioning roles, and she looks at the various waves of feminism in the genesis of gender, but how Judith Butler very much completely unhitched, as I say, gender, biology, and femininity, and when that happens, nature no longer plays any part at all in terms of determining these matters.
Right.
So that's, again, part of our bid to overcome nature.
Yes.
And my thing, who am I to disagree with anything that C.S. Lewis said? But he said that reality, which is more than nature, but it certainly includes nature, was iconoclastic. And he said when our delusions bump up against the real, they would crash. It would break the icon. And I'm not sure that's true. I actually think we live in virtual worlds of abstraction, worlds of slogans where reality is not getting through like it did 20, 30 years ago. So that's another challenge for us. I'm not sure reality really is iconoclastic in the way he thought it was.
Is there some hope that at least in Britain, at least as regards trans, that there are feminists such as Mary Harrington and Louise Perry, and such as Kathleen Stock, who are such as J.K. Rowling, not a lesbian, but obviously pushing back against some of the trans stuff. And has there been a little bit of a turn? Have people kind of recognized the limits of nature to some degree and are questioning ideology?
I think I'm very encouraged by people who are questioning it at a very high level. The impact lower down, I'm not sure we've seen that catch hold yet. It's the debate, isn't it? I'm sure you've been in it. I remember 5-6 years ago, people saying the snake has already eaten itself, it's dead, and it's not. In some ways, you could say within the establishment, in a university like the one here in Cambridge, it seems to be gaining ground still.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but I am encouraged by really, really thoughtful voices who show the contradictions.
Yes. And are those voices from the church or not? Because, one explanation I've heard for why there's been a resistance in the UK to some of this stuff in a way that there isn't in the US, it's because you can dismiss resistance to trans stuff in the US as that's the religious right. Yeah. Whereas there is no real religious right in the UK, and therefore that kind of explains the discrepancy. Would you see a discrepancy between how these issues are handled in the US and in the UK, and what would you put it down to?
Yeah, I think I buy the explanation that writing it off, that's just the right speaking, makes it much easier to dismiss an argument. I wish there were more public evangelical voices contributing more helpfully to this. The Genesis of Gender is written by a Catholic, and she just does a wonderful job. It's interesting, Glenn. She has a high view of the body, which I think the Bible ought to give us. And she talks about the sacramentality of our biology, because we're ensouled beings. That actually makes the body holy. And I thought, I don't know many Protestants. I mean, the sacramentality, that's a big word. Sometimes I draw back from it, but I loved her boldness in just coming straight out and saying the body is made holy by virtue of how we're created. I think we need that kind of strong basis if we're going to make a real contribution here. And it struck me, I think she as a Catholic could do that, because it's very much in her DNA as a Catholic, where we as evangelicals, I think, are still rather shy of making those kind of statements.
Yes. And she's a woman. And all the people that I've mentioned so far, from J.K. Rowling to Kathleen Stock to Louise Perry to Mary Harrington, Abigail you're mentioning, and I wonder whether, especially, I think all these women, apart from Kathleen Stock, have had experience of childbearing as well. And all of them speak of the... certainly those I'm aware of, they speak of the importance of feeling their bodies and feeling the embodied nature of their femininity and what their bodies were made for, in a way that I think Louise Perry certainly talks about how In more traditional cultures, you would go from maiden to mother to matriarch, and women had those sort of stages along the journey. But we've completely infantilized ourselves as a culture, and the sexual revolution has kind of stalled us at maiden. And as soon as a woman doesn't look like a maiden, she is kind of out of, she has no social cachet anymore. But all these women are kind of noticing the transition to motherhood. So that's what my body is for. And
Absolutely.
and that sort of the interdependence of the body gives you a post-liberal kind of vision of reality. The liberal vision of reality is very much the person behind the veil of ignorance who, is a decision-making kind of actor, an agent, and very much that far better fits the male experience of the world, because men are not attached to their offspring in anything like the same way as a woman is attached. And I just wonder whether women are at the forefront of some of these fights because they're women and because of the experience of motherhood.
Yeah, that comes through in all my reading of these people too. And it is interesting to hear them as they express their own experience of bearing children. They use a language again of sacredness in terms of what it was for them. I mean, I don't want to cry into my cup of tea about how awful it is for white males, but I think on a lot of these issues we're limited as white males who are heterosexual if we are, and who are able-bodied if we are. It's increasingly difficult in public for us to have a voice. So I'm very thankful for women, people like Douglas Murray. Absolutely amazing to hear him speak so clearly to issues, and I'm sure his same-sex attraction is part of what allows him to sort of get a platform in a way that others of us might not be able to get.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. Now, tell me...
And I'm not calling any of these people Balaam's ass, but I call it the Balaam's ass principle. The Lord will always find a way to speak into the public arena, and if he has to use a donkey or an ass, he can use one of them.
Yes. So you're not completely without hope for the fact that nature will make itself felt again, and that people will sort of wake up to some of this stuff?
Oh, definitely. There's no place for despair in the life of any Christian. It's not just rhetoric. We are on the winning side, and I hold to an eschatology which is very positive. I think this is a remarkable moment, and a moment ripe for a revival, a great revival. Glenn, I'm beginning to meet people here in Cambridge who are educated, and they're unreached. I said to my wife the other Sunday, after some people came in from the outside with never been in a church before, highly educated, we had a chat, and I realized they're starting from ground zero. It would be like going to the Congo and sharing with people there who'd never heard the gospel. And I thought, how exciting. There's no baggage here.
Yes.
We are now in a country where the 20s and 30s are largely unreached. And I think it's an amazing opportunity. And we have to do some hard work in terms of overcoming charges of misogyny, which I think has been rife through the history of the church, our unfair treatment of people with same-sex attraction. So we still have a lot to unpack, but to some degree, I think some of the baggage is beginning to clear. And I find I can open the Bible directly with people in a way I couldn't 20 years ago. Okay. It's a foreign book, and they're rather intrigued by it.
Yes, it's exotic, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And even on sexuality, when people say, "Oh, are you one of those who don't believe in gay sex?" and I tell them, "Oh, it's way worse than that. I actually don't believe in sex outside of marriage. It's a much more of a conundrum than you could even imagine." And at that point, they say, "Wow, really?
Yes.
I never heard anything like it.
Yes.
You mean you only think married people should have sex?" Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. That's incredible.
Right.
Exotic. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I was so encouraged by the questions that Kate Forbes was being asked in 2023 as she went, was campaigning to be the leader of the Scottish National Party, and she lost out to Hamza Yousaf as the First Minister of Scotland. But she was trying to be skewered by journalists in 2023 in a different way to how Tim Farron was trying to be skewered in 2016.
Agreed.
So the question that was constantly asked of Tim Farron, who was the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the UK between 2016 and 2017, he was it 2015, 2016? Anyway, about 6 years ago. He was constantly being asked, do you think that homosexual sex is a sin? And they had clearly honed that question so that there was no wiggle room. So they pinned it down to the actual activity rather than any kind of orientation or same-sex attraction. Do you think homosexual sex itself is a sin? And he was asked that dozens of times by journalists over the course of about 18 months. And then fast forward to 2023, they're constantly asking Kate Forbes, do you think that sex outside marriage is a sin? I see that as a huge step forward, because I think it shows that people are waking up to just how weird Christians are, and that can only be good.
Absolutely. Interesting. I didn't pick that up. That's fascinating.
You are leading a church in Cambridge that is for exactly this kind of moment and exactly these kind of people. Tell me about your church, and tell me about what is resonating with the sorts of people that are coming to you in Cambridge.
Yeah, it's a newish venture, about 18 months old. We broke all the church rules of church planting, maybe deliberately. Just a small group who felt called to do something different. Cambridge, as you know, Glenn, is full of big, vibrant churches, and this is no criticism of them. They're doing a great work. But I have friends who lead those churches, and they'd be the first to admit that they're making really no impact on the unchurched, on the unreached. And I think most of what happens in our fine churches is just about completely incomprehensible to people who are on the outside, what I'm calling now the unreached. So we felt called to set up something very small. It's interesting, in America, I'm told they're already pronouncing the death of the megachurch. It's beginning to hemorrhage. I think it's a younger generation who wants something very different. They want connection, they want community, they want conversation, they want the kind of ecology within a church framework where they can really talk through their questions. So we wanted to create the kind of church that did that. Blaise Pascal, he's got a quote for everything. I love Blaise, but I love his one on men despise religion. That was true of his time. The cure, he says, first is make it reasonable, not rational, but reasonable, so it's worthy of respect. And then he says, make it attractive, so good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. And I think it's that attraction side which is the hope going forward. And it's not rocket science. It's real fellowship, real relationship where Christ is the center. I think we have to Jesus is beautiful beyond telling, and we have to reflect that to this generation.
Right.
Someone asked me the other day, we have people coming, starting from ground zero, and they bought into the ideology of the West, and it's certainly not Christian. So what's your strategy, they said, Andrew, for making sure that they're sound on sex and so forth? And I said, well, my strategy is simply this. Just keep preaching the wonder and beauty of Jesus every single Sunday, his truth and his goodness. And over time, as they begin to give him greater and greater allegiance, they'll say, I wonder what Jesus thinks about these matters. And yeah. I
love it. And what are you finding is resonating with the unchurched in Cambridge who are trying you out? And what are you finding that sort of bumps up against people's presuppositions?
Yeah, I think my presupposition is that late modernity or hypermodernity has reached a colossal meaning deficit. And I'm meeting now these people who actually say that there is not enough meaning to support our existence. They're being honest about that. I mean, you're involved in the world of evangelism and apologetics. It's one of my pet peeves that we address lots of issues that nobody is actually interested in today. And I think an apologetic of meaning is critical for our times. And we have something to say to that issue. So I find myself frequently in my teaching of the Bible showing the meaning. It's just as simple as that. That's part of the attraction. Wow. Yeah.
And are people naming it as such? I mean, there is such a thing as a meaning crisis, and John Vervaeke, who's not a Christian, kind of coined that phrase. Yeah. And we certainly play around with that. But I often find just in regular evangelism, just talking to friends and neighbors, they have a meaning crisis, but they don't know what to call it. There's such an apatheism, apathetic atheism, that they're not even aware that they're an atheist, and then they're not even aware that there's an alternative, and so they don't know the problem yet. Are people naming the issue of I don't know what meaning is, or if they're not, what kind of language are they using?
Yeah, good question. I suspect, and I don't have the research to back it up, I'm not a researcher, so this is anecdotal. I suspect something is turning as we speak, and that people are just beginning to name it, which I'm very encouraged by. So again, no cause for despair. In our idolatries, those who make them become like them. We become eviscerated by our idols, and our idols today are so poverty-stricken. So I am hearing people using the language of meaning. I've done some lecturing. It wasn't that long ago, 20 years ago, Monty Python, where the meaning of life was a joke. I mean, what is the meaning of life? And you do a funny skit and everybody would have a good laugh and let's have some more pints. But actually, it's no longer the joke question. I'm beginning to detect. And you'll probably be aware of this. Just look online in terms of books coming on about meaning in every field, from the sciences, all the sciences, through to the humanities. Meaning is a huge issue. I'm finding myself overwhelmed by just the amount of literature I'm needing to read to try and keep abreast of this, because I think this is the moment for Christians to seriously address the issue.
And you're saying you address that by every week turning to Jesus and exploring, exposing his beauty, his glory, his truth. I guess that sounds like pretty normal, and I guess you like the fact that sounds pretty normal. So if I show up at your church on a Sunday, what does it look like?
Well, it is quite normal. It's actually fairly formal, as in we have a quite liturgical service, and then the talk, and then we close it. I think what might be different is that after we've formally cut off, we're sitting in the room together, and I have to sit down again at the front in a chair, and we talk about it. And I find the unreached have the most questions, and they're not shy of asking them, and they're slightly disappointed when we need to close that down because they want to keep talking. They really do have questions. The ones who are attending, you're right. There are many who haven't yet woken up to see the big questions, but I think I see a growing awareness that we don't have enough. So maybe the question time would be the unique part, and I think we're small enough that people can see that we actually do love being together. We're very small. We've only just started out, but we had a couple come in recently, and they were just struck by the joy we showed in being together. I think too that reflecting a deep creational awareness, Christ's lordship over all of life, is critical for the meaning side.
Yes.
The other Sunday, the woman who led prayers prayed for filmmakers, you'll be glad to know, and for those involved in tech, trying to work out the ethics of it. Well, two of the unreached who were there, was one in film and the other was in tech ethics, and they were utterly blown away that they never hadn't. I think one of them had never been to church before. That you can come into a church and these Christians pray for things like that.
What are your theological assumptions and presuppositions that allow you to do that? Because one thing I've picked up from Jordan Peterson, and I've always had a kind of a love-hate relationship with Jordan Peterson, and over the last sort of 7 years, you'll find all sorts of videos, and I'll say, I love this, and here's this caveat, and I love this, and here's this caveat. But the one thing that I love is that somebody like a Jordan Peterson will open up the Bible as though it is a human text addressed to humans to humanize us. And he treats it as though it is for us and for the explanation of the world, rather than as a textbook to help fine-tune the discipleship of some super spiritual Christians on a Sunday. Absolutely. And it sounds to me like you're treating the scriptures and in a way that, you have to go to Jordan Peterson, like Calvin saw them as spectacles through which you see the world, and through which you expand your vision, such that the terminating point of your vision is not simply a text, but through that text you have an expanded vision for the whole of life seen in the light of Christ. And for me, that kind of theology is absolutely vital for us to take hold of if we're going to speak to a world that wants to make sense of the whole thing. And if we're only heard to be saying, oh, you need to narrow your gaze down to this ancient text, that won't fly. But if we say to them, this text, put this on, try these goggles on for size, and we will expand your vision and give you the context in which you live your life, and their meaning is found. For me, that's the kind of theology that helps me to integrate both the Bible and the meaning crisis and say that the one is the answer to the other. Tell me about your own theology and how do you read the scriptures, and how is it that the scriptures become the answer to the meaning crisis rather than another hobby that certain spiritual people like to do on a Sunday?
Yeah, so helpful the way you put that. I think Christians should have the deepest and widest vision and perception of anyone on this planet, because we read reality through Scripture. I love Heschel. He said, the Bible is God's anthropology. It's not primarily what men think about God. In fact, I would say it's not that at all. But it is a lot about what God says about us. So the Bible matches the human condition at every single level. One of these unreached was shocked the other day when I did something at the end of Philippians 4 on anxiety.
Right.
And I just mentioned in passing, the Bible mentions anxiety all the way through. Well, wow. Because here we are in the anxious age. You mean the Bible has something to say about human anxiety? You wouldn't believe how much it has to say about that particular subject. The stream I've moved in since I was first a Christian, this started through Francis Schaeffer, who started L'Abri, but it's the Kuyperian tradition, the wonderful Dutch thinker through Bavinck and philosopher Dooyeweerd. And I think one of the geniuses of this particular tradition is how it opens our eyes to how Christ impacts all of life, and that impacts then how we read the scriptures.
Yeah. Yes. No, I love that, and I get that from your speaking and writing, that expansive vision of all creation. So tell me then about this book that you've written, Smuggling Jesus Back into Church. It's a captivating title. Where does it come from?
It actually was shortlisted by the American Booksellers Association in a category for strangest titles. It's like those terrible films that you get, special designations for being the worst film. Now, this is for strange titles. I didn't win it, but a group took notice of the title. I first encountered the phrase when someone described Soren Kierkegaard's life mission as smuggling Jesus back into the Lutheran Church. And I thought that was very, very funny. Because, of course, there is no church without Jesus. Why would you have to smuggle him back in?
Well, I've been to some churches.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, in some respects, it's just sit with me more and more, the phrase over the years, which is why I nailed it for the title of this book. It's really a book about worldliness. So the great triad in the New Testament letters in terms of our enemies is the flesh, the devil, and the world. And I think generally most Christians understand the devil in terms of this is a real fight here against spiritual powers. The flesh maybe not quite so good on that, but yep, there's something about our fleshly nature that is a real struggle. But I think we've become almost clueless about what the world is today and why the world is a problem. Partly because in the 60s and 70s we trivialized it through a whole bunch of behaviors that we needed to avoid. So worldliness was not going to cinema, not drinking, not smoking, and so forth. And I think we've largely moved beyond that and not replaced the category of the world with something which is biblically coherent. So I'm putting in a good word for what the world is in Scripture. I think it's a front to back theme, so a very important theme. And I'm trying to diagnose what worldliness looks like in the contemporary church, and why it's something we should take very, very seriously.
I guess in the New Testament you've got these two emphases, don't you, going on? I mean, you've obviously got John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. And then you've got 1 John, is it 1 John chapter 2, around about verses 14 or 15? Do not love the world.
Yeah.
Or anything that is in the world.
Yep.
And it seems like there are some Christians who just camp out on that text, and they become quite anti creation and quite anti the arts, for instance.
And culture. They hate culture.
Right. So is that a bad reading of 1 John chapter 2? Please tell me that's a bad reading.
Not just bad. I'm going to call it catastrophic.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the implications of that, which some Christians have taken on, are a disaster because it removes them from the real world. Actually, moves them from the good of God's creation order. So they begin to not say not good to things God calls entirely good, like the arts,
Right.
like wonderful food, and I mean everything that belongs to human culture. So yeah, I have to do some backtracking in this book, chapter 2, to say the world is not culture. And I define the world as cultural values, which give direction and orientation, actually not just to a few, but to the whole culture. And so I define 4 massive cultural values, which I think give huge direction to the modern age today, the modern West.
Go on, tell us the 4.
Egoism. It's all about me, centrality of the self. Naturalism. What I see is what exists, and there is nothing beyond that. So the loss of metaphysics. Hedonism. My bodily pleasures are what my life is for. Not to say bodily pleasure is all wrong, but if you say that's what your life for, you're in a mess. That defines our age. And the 4th one, the controversial one, is politicism, that politics is what primarily makes the world right, by diagnosing the problem of sin and then by bringing a solution. And I think much of the church has bought into politicism as a salvation strategy, on the right and the left, and I'm just tired of it.
Yeah. Let's press into that in a second, because I'd love to think about politicism. But like egoism and naturalism. I mean, for a start, those are at war with one another, aren't they? If you're a thoroughgoing naturalist, what place is there for the self anyway? Like, how do those two things play out in our culture?
Well, I think, I mean, we see them everywhere. So I would say the dialectic that the modern world is founded on is completely contradictory, but it doesn't mean that we don't commit to both. And actually, that's the wonderful thing about a cultural apologetics that actually uses a critique, a biblical critique, to see what's actually going on, because it can see the contradictions. And the big contradiction is autonomous freedom. So we mentioned this earlier, our freedom even to overcome nature. And at the very same time to say biology is absolutely everything, in which, of course, you have no room for freedom. But autonomous freedom and the absolute nature of atoms being everything, I think, are 2 commitments that the vast majority today hold to.
Yes. Which is called cognitive dissonance, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, but the thing is, Glenn, I think it should cause cognitive dissonance. But as you say, I think people live with them because they don't think about them very deeply. But it is the cognitive dissonance of our times. You can't have both. It's either or. Yes. And generally, in my conversation with non-Christians, I often want to take the conversation exactly in that direction.
Yes.
Which is it?
Yes. So in The Air We Breathe, I talk about 7 values. We've got equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And we imagine that those are the values of secular humanism. But I want to pull apart those 2 words. They're certainly humanistic values, but did they derive from a non-religious view of the world? Well, I guess the naturalistic view is that we are very clever apes with inviolable human rights.
Yeah.
There's the, or,
exactly.
We are the products of a brutal evolutionary history and we should be kind.
Yeah.
Or on the issue of consent, you and me, baby, we ain't nothing but mammals, so let's honor one another's sexual boundaries at all times. But what's great about pressing into this with our non-religious friends is they do live for the equality, compassion, consent. They do live for those, like if they're asked to choose, they choose the humanistic values every time. It's just they have no foundations for them.
Yep.
And then we have the privilege of saying, would you like me to A, heal your cognitive dissonance, and B, give you some foundations for this castle in the air that you seem to be inhabiting? Because it doesn't make sense without Jesus.
Absolutely. I have to say, I am more and more taken with what I call the thinkers or philosophers of pessimism, who go to the other side.
Right.
In a sense, starting with someone like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in the 19th century, and say, all those values you've mentioned are utter nonsense. Animals, this is in the gay science. Humans have no special attributes that allow them for these kind of things. We are naked apes, cleverer than the rest, but that's just what we are. And here are the consequences. I'm doing some work with Bertrand Russell at the moment. And actually, it's amazing. He really tried hard to be utterly consistent.
Yes.
He was trying to find, this is 1903, a free man's worship. He's trying to find what he calls safe harbor for the soul. But he said it can only be built on the unyielding foundation of total despair. Wow.
Yeah. Right. Right. And choose now,
Yeah.
Do you, secular or humanist, pick one.
Yeah.
And I'm only now really trying to piece together what this sounds like in my evangelistic conversations. But there's something in me that wants to say to my friends who claim not to be a believer, I say, well, you are believing in these intangible, unprovable things like human rights and equality and diversity and inclusion and freedom and progress and all these wonderful things. And you're orienting your life by them. I would say these are pretty strong beliefs that you hold. Now, let me show you the only foundation that actually works for this stuff. But one of the steps that's in there is saying to my friend, you might think that you couldn't believe in the supernatural, but every time you get goosebumps, seeing compassion, every time you see a good Samaritan do that thing and you think, yes, that is glorious, you are having a sense of the supernatural because nature doesn't act like that. This is something that is above nature, that is greater than nature. Is it right for me to say to people, you are having a quasi-Christian experience. You're having a kind of an experience of faith and something very supernatural-ish. Keep leaning in there, and on the far end of that you might find Jesus at the other end. I don't even know what I'm saying, but is there something there?
I think there is. These are all what Peter Berger calls whispers or signals of transcendence. And we have to follow those signals and take them where they lead us. I guess you see, I'm also a Calvinist, which doesn't make me a pessimist. The human heart is at enmity with God. All these signals lead people in a certain direction, but at the end of the day, their allergy to God has to be broken down. I'm someone who hasn't, much like the language of an almost believer, I can't quite reconcile that with my reading of Scripture. But I really like what you're doing there. I'm just finishing a manuscript in this next few weeks on anthropology, Humanity Matters, Re-Enchanting Homo Sapiens. And it's looking at what I call our dappled anthropology and just all the places where it reflects soulishness. There's so much about a human person that reflects. It can only be understood metaphysically. And what I call the hardware account makes utter nonsense of so many of our capacities. So again, should we despair? No. So meaning, do we have something to say about meaning? Yeah, I think we do. Anthropology, because we're in an anthropological crisis, do we have something to say? Yes, we do.
We're also in a political crisis, Andrew, and politicization is one of those four aspects of culture that is wreaking havoc with us. You mentioned that there's a left-wing and a right-wing version of this. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, I mean, what interests me is, and this is where I think it is an aspect of our worldliness today, is that the culture wars out there have become the culture wars inside the church. Well, that for me is a sure sign that we've become worldly. And the division perhaps greater in North America than Europe, but I think it's very strong here too. People are choosing either completely for the right, completely for the left, which I just think is very unwise. I tell people there's a raft of issues, and if you push me on some of them, I'm left, and on some of them I'm right. But I find it amazing that any Christian could say I'm only right or only left. And I think, the culture war now inside the church has just infected us with this sensibility that political power is what's going to change the world. And maybe I overstated it, but I actually think politics has always been overrated in terms of the real change it brings. It creates a lot of noise. I think a political revolution brings major change, but I'm not sure politics itself changes much. And it just seems we bought into the Constantinian framework of we have to overturn what happened when the Edict of Milan was reversed and get power in the public place again. So this is quite against my roots, my Kuyperian roots.
Well, I was about to say, every square inch belongs to Jesus. So.
Yep.
The public square is ours, Andrew. Why don't you forthrightly declare Jesus in that? Yeah.
I think we should declare Jesus there, but I have more questions than answers. I'm beginning to say what place for our political engagement today. Some have a natural calling, like Katie Forbes, wonderful. Pray for her, support her, encourage her. But I think the idea that we have to take power back in Westminster is rather naive. The way I see it, look at the 2nd and 3rd century church before Constantine. None of them had a dream or a hope of gaining influence there. I'm told there was almost no Christian Roman senators through the first centuries. Absolutely extraordinary. But look at the change they made. And in fact, that's part of where my reading is at the moment. It's just marvelous what happened in terms of transforming Roman civilization that had nothing to do with politics. And I think those are the models we need today, just to remind us that we don't need politics. We don't need Constantine to do the job. And I love, is it 1 Thessalonians 4? Paul says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. And when I hear Christians mouthing it off in public, sometimes I think, maybe we should all just commit more to making it our ambition to lead a quiet life. And the context of that is love each other, love your neighbors, make a difference in your locality. That's what Paul's saying there.
Yes, yeah. I've just written a thing on Abraham and whether the Abraham option should be considered by Christians. It was inspired by a sermon that I did on Genesis chapter 14, and it was fascinating as I was preparing this sermon. You've got wars in the culture. In fact, it's the first chapter that covers war in the Bible. It's also the first mention of kings, and those two things probably go together. As soon as you start talking about political rulers, you start getting wars. And you've got the 4 kings versus the 5 kings. You've got sort of the superpowers versus the corrupt sort of Sodom and Gomorrah, that kind of thing. And war wages there for year after year after year after year, and Abraham does not get involved. He's just building the household of faith by the oaks of Mamre. And at some stage, he does enter the fray because the 4 kings come and sweep away the 5 kings, and eventually they sweep away Lot, Abraham's relative, along with Sodom, and eventually Abraham enters the fray with his 318 soldiers, and they kind of in a sense are co-belligerent with the 5 kings, and they bring a victory. They recover Lot, but then Abraham sort of brings everything to Melchizedek, this priest king, the king of Jerusalem, king of peace, bread and wine, brings them to a feast, and he does everything he can to say, actually, I'm not with you, king of Sodom. I might have fought alongside you in that one battle to save a member of the household of faith, but now we're going back to the trees of Mamre, and now we're just going to build the household of faith, And I wonder whether the Abraham option kind of gives you some flexibility, because at times there are issues over which we might say this is a justice issue. Yeah. And for the sake of justice, we enter into the fray, but we we make it really clear that we're co-belligerent with these people who are not actually our allies, and we follow the Lord. Is there something to that?
So helpful. That's very that helps me helps push back against some of my leanings at the moment. Because I'm very interested in politics. I'm just tired of the noise from Christians. But I think that's really, really helpful. It strikes me that there was an opportunity, there was a door too that opened for Abraham there, and I think that's partly where we need to be as Christians and Christians who feel committed to the public domain. What opportunities are there for us now? And if it's not taking our influence as high as Westminster or the White House, where are other places where we can do it? Doors open, doors close. I think many of us still carry on as if not a great deal has changed, but a lot has changed.
A lot has changed.
So that's where I like church history. Let's look at what what Christians have done through the ages in terms of judging the open door and what they can do for the Lord, either publicly or a little bit more quietly.
Yes. Yeah. So give us, you're a hopeful preacher and writer, Andrew. So give us some hope as we round out this conversation. We've seen some of the dangers of culture. How do we orient ourselves around Jesus such that we can have hope?
Yeah, so with Jesus at the center, there's two things I say to people today. No grievance. We live, coming back to the political thing, it's the politics of grievance just mark everything. Yeah. And sadly, people I admire deeply who are Christians in the public place have, in the last year, become angry. I hear it in their voice, in their public interviews. Let's say we're not going to collude in any way in the politics of grievance, as bad as it gets, and no despair. There is no place for despair in our lives as Christians. And I think the difference we make starts in our homes. Someone I know, not a Christian, spent some time recently in a home, husband and wife and children, where Christ was the center, were utterly blown away by their experience of being there for a weekend. Right. I'm a firm believer that in its right context, beauty will save the world. Famous quote from Dostoevsky's The Idiot. I think we have measures by which to create the beautiful in our communities, in our artworks, in our conversation, which are staggering in a culture that becomes increasingly ugly. I don't see why we would ever despair. I think this sounds a bit corny. This is our moment to shine. We really can.
Yes. Well, I think that's true. Give us, okay, that was going to be your final word, but now you've got onto the subject of art. Give us some courage. I think within the church, especially within the evangelical wing of the church, we feel like a poor cousin to more traditional, churches, but also very much country mouse to the city mouse of the world and its cultural achievements and the art that it produces. But you're saying we can uniquely produce a captivating beauty that will arrest the attention of the world. Convince us.
Well, it's not going to come easily. I don't think any artist who made a significant statement did it without great cost to themselves. I think what strikes me about some of my heroes in the arts through history is they didn't make notoriety once their chief ambition. They were just committed to good craft, and they let the good craft speak. I think that's true of all of life. I've got a friend here in the university who just puts a whole lot into his lecturing in his particular faculty, because lecturers at Cambridge tend not to do it very well. He says, I want to give my students a feast every week. He's a Christian, and he just dedicates himself to the craft, and he's quite surprised. His lecture hall is full at the moment. Same with the arts.
Yes. But I guess you've got to have that conviction that this is how people tick, that culture is a good thing, that beauty is a good thing.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
That reading of 1 John chapter 2 is not the correct reading, that God loves the world and we are to love the world in that same way. Yeah. And that people as heart-led kind of creatures will respond to beauty, and that our response will be pulled out of us by the glory of beauty.
That's where I link beauty with soul care. So you go into most town city centers and the number of block buildings that have this mirrored glass that just dazzles the eye so you can't see properly. Hideously ugly, and they're eviscerating the soulish side of us. And I think part of our compassion is to create spaces. I'm quite interested in habitation and how our homes, our churches, our gardens, our local communities become fit habitations for ensouled people. And yeah, because we need beauty.
Wow. This is a wonderful advertisement for your book. It's also a wonderful advertisement for the Speak Life intensives. And if people love the sorts of stuff that Andrew is talking about, this intersection of theology and mission and creativity with art, kind of captivating hearts and minds for Jesus, check out the Speak Life intensive. We'd love to have you along, but we'd also love to send you along to read Andrew Fellow's new book. I take it you can get it at all good bookstores?
That is the case. IVP have published it.
IVP published, Smuggling Jesus Back into the Church. Andrew Fellows, you have given us a feast today, so thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, Glenn. Blessings on you.